Scary telling.
I remember the day Abigail Kane went missing like it was yesterday. It was a warm summer evening, and I was sitting in my living room, flicking through the channels on TV. I had just finished eating another bowl of Linda's stew, and I was feeling bored and restless. That's when I heard Linda call out from the kitchen. "I'm heating up some more of that stew, okay, Mike?" That was an amazing stew, but 3 nights in a row? I shouted back. "Well, it's that or nothing." Linda replied. "Stew it is then," I said, not really caring what we had for dinner. I flipped through a few more channels before settling on the news. I remember thinking how surreal it was to see our neighbor, Ben Kane, on TV, pleading for his daughter's safe return. Abigail was only 4 years old and had been playing innocently on her front lawn when she disappeared. I called out to Linda to come and see the news report. "What? What's wrong?" she asked, poking her head through the doorway. "Look. Abigail from next door, she's been taken," I said, pointing at the TV. "What?" Linda's voice turned squeaky. "Look, it's a live feed, that's our house." I quickly stood and walked towards the window. Outside, there were at least a dozen police officers, some with sniffer dogs, and several TV news vans. A growing crowd of neighbors had gathered, all trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. "We should come away from the windows," Linda said, pulling the curtain shut. "I don't want any of them to see us." I turned back to the TV, watching as the news reporter described the search efforts for Abigail. It's been just over 72 hours now since Abigail was first reported missing, and as you can see behind me, the police are still patrolling the area with sniffer dogs, hoping to pick up any kind of lead. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could someone just snatch a little girl from her own front yard? And what kind of sick person would do something like that? Linda came back into the room with a bowl of stew and placed it in front of me. "I don't know how you can eat at a time like this," I said, pushing the bowl away. Linda looked at me, her eyes full of worry. "I don't know what else to do," she said softly. I realized then that Linda was just as scared and upset as I was. We had always been close with the Kanes, and the thought of something happening to Abigail was too much to bear. As the days went on, the search for Abigail continued, but with each passing day, the chances of finding her alive grew slimmer. The community was on edge, and every time we heard a police siren or saw a search helicopter overhead, our hearts would race. I couldn't help but wonder who could have done this, and if they were still out there, watching us from the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and Abigail still hadn't been found. The community was starting to lose hope, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Linda continued to make stew every night, but her behavior was starting to become more and more suspicious. She spent more time in the kitchen, and I noticed that she was always on edge, like she was waiting for something to happen. One night, as I was eating my stew, I noticed something strange floating in the broth. At first, I thought it was just a piece of vegetable, but on closer inspection, I realized it was a strand of hair. I showed it to Linda, who looked surprised and promised to be more careful in the future. But the hair kept appearing in every pot of stew, and each time it was a different color. I started to get more and more suspicious of Linda. I couldn't help but wonder if she was hiding something from me. Every time I tried to ask her about the hair in the stew, she would get defensive and change the subject. One day, while I was home alone, I decided to investigate. I went into the kitchen and looked through the cabinets and drawers, trying to find anything that would explain Linda's strange behavior. That's when I found a Jolly Holly doll with pink and silver hair. It looked just like the doll that Abigail was always playing with in her front yard. My heart raced as I realized what this could mean. Was Linda involved in Abigail's disappearance? Did she have something to do with the hair in the stew? I confronted Linda when she came home that night, showing her the doll and demanding to know what was going on. But she just looked at me with tears in her eyes and said that she didn't know anything about Abigail's disappearance. I didn't know what to think. Was Linda lying to me, or was she just as clueless as I was? The thought of her being involved in something so heinous was too much to bear. The hair in the stew continued to appear, and I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. I started to keep a close eye on Linda, watching her every move and trying to find any evidence that would prove her guilt or innocence. But the more I watched her, the more confused I became. She didn't act like someone who was involved in a crime. She seemed genuinely upset about Abigail's disappearance and was doing everything she could to help find her. I didn't know what to think anymore. The hair in the stew was still appearing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As the days turned into weeks, my suspicions about Linda continued to grow. The hair in the stew kept appearing, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was involved in Abigail's disappearance. One day, I was watching the news when they showed a report on Abigail's case. They were talking about how the police had widened their search area, and they showed a picture of Abigail's Jolly Holly doll with its bright pink and silver hair. I immediately recognized the doll as the same one that Linda had in her kitchen. My heart raced as I realized what this could mean. Was Linda involved in Abigail's disappearance? I started to watch Linda more closely, trying to find any evidence that would prove her guilt or innocence. But she seemed to be on edge all the time, like she was hiding something. One day, she disappeared for hours, and I didn't know where she had gone. When she came back, she looked even more nervous than before. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted her about the hair in the stew and the Jolly Holly doll. But she just looked at me with tears in her eyes and denied any involvement in Abigail's disappearance. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was Linda lying to me, or was she telling the truth? One day, while Linda was out, I decided to snoop around our house. I went into the basement and found a box that was full of old dolls and toys. And then I saw it, the Jolly Holly doll, covered in mud and what looked like blood. My heart raced as I realized what this meant. Linda had been hiding the doll, and it looked like it had been used in a crime. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to confront her about it. When Linda came home, I showed her the doll and demanded to know what was going on. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and finally confessed. She told me that she had taken Abigail and used her in the stew. She said that she didn't mean to hurt her and that she was just trying to protect our family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could someone do something so heinous? I was disgusted and horrified at the same time. Linda was taken away by the police, and I was left to deal with the aftermath of her actions. I couldn't believe that someone I had loved and trusted could be capable of something so terrible. I started to question everything about our relationship. Had Linda been hiding other secrets from me? Had I missed the signs that she was capable of something like this? The community was left reeling from the news, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The thought of Abigail's innocent life being taken away was too much to bear, and I knew that I would never be able to forget what had happened. After Linda was taken away by the police, I was left to deal with the aftermath of her actions. I was consumed with guilt and grief, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have seen the signs that something was wrong. The community was reeling from the news, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Abigail's disappearance and Linda's arrest had shaken us all to the core, and it would take a long time for us to recover. I tried to go about my daily life, but I was haunted by the memory of what had happened. Every time I walked by the Canes' house, I couldn't help but imagine what had happened to Abigail and how scared she must have been. The police continued to investigate, trying to piece together what had happened to Abigail. They found evidence in Linda's basement that confirmed she had used the Jolly Holly doll in the stew, but they couldn't find any evidence that proved she had killed Abigail. As the weeks turned into months, the community started to move on, but the memory of Abigail's disappearance still lingered. I couldn't help but wonder if we would ever find out what had really happened to her. I started to see a therapist to help me deal with my guilt and grief. It was a slow process, but over time, I started to come to terms with what had happened. One day, I received a call from the police. They had found a body in the nearby woods, and they believed it was Abigail. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. Abigail was gone, and there was nothing we could do to bring her back. The community was devastated by the news, and we all gathered together to mourn Abigail's loss. We held a candlelight vigil in her memory, and we promised that we would never forget her. The police continued to investigate, and they eventually found evidence that confirmed Linda had killed Abigail. She had taken her into the woods and killed her, using the Jolly Holly doll in the process. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could someone do something so terrible to an innocent child? I was filled with anger and sadness, and I knew that Linda would never be able to make up for what she had done. The community slowly started to heal, but the memory of Abigail's disappearance and death would always haunt us. We had lost a little girl who had her whole life ahead of her, and we would never forget the impact she had on our community. I knew that we would never be able to fully understand why Linda had done what she had done, but I hoped that one day we would find a way to prevent something like this from happening again. As time passed, the memory of Abigail's disappearance and Linda's actions started to fade, but they would always be a part of our community's history. We had been through a traumatic experience, and it had left us all scarred in some way. I started to get involved in community organizations that were dedicated to preventing crimes against children. I wanted to do everything I could to make sure that what had happened to Abigail never happened again. I also started to volunteer at a local children's hospital, reading to sick children and doing anything I could to make their stay a little brighter. It was my way of giving back and trying to make a positive impact on the world. Over time, I started to heal from the trauma of Abigail's disappearance and Linda's actions. I knew that I would never forget what had happened, but I was able to move forward and find a new sense of purpose in my life. The community also started to heal, and we became closer than ever before. We had been through a tragedy together, and it had brought us together in a way that nothing else could. The memory of Abigail would always be with us, but we knew that we had to keep moving forward. We had to honor her memory by making the world a better place and by never forgetting the lessons we had learned from her tragic death. I hoped that Linda would one day find a way to make amends for what she had done, but I knew that it was unlikely. Her actions had caused irreparable damage, and she would have to live with the consequences for the rest of her life. In the end, Abigail's disappearance had taught us all a valuable lesson. We had learned that we must always be vigilant and do everything we can to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. Abigail's life had been cut short, but her legacy would live on forever. We would never forget her, and we would always strive to make the world a better place in her memory.